Good morning. It's encouraging to see such a major turnout for this event today, which is a look at the question of, is Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States a threat to the United States domestically or globally? And obviously, the other side of the coin is it a threat to the United States not to get Chinese foreign direct investment? This is what our speakers will be examining. The background for this event is the recent publication of the first major detailed study of foreign direct investment coming into the United States. There's been interest in this subject, but there has not been a thorough statistical basis to assist informed Americans in understanding what the implications of Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States are, what the benefits are, and what the potential risks are. I expect that during the course of the discussion this morning, we will all get a better understanding of what the balance of those considerations is. Our speakers, Dan Rosen and Derek Scissors, are genuine experts in this area. Dan is a visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute on International Economics. Hello. And Derek Scissors is with the Heritage Foundation working on economic investment issues. Is that a... Among others, yes. Among other questions. Both have long backgrounds in this field. The study, which forms the basis for the discussion today, was jointly sponsored by the Asia Society and the Kissinger Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Institute. Jack Garrity is with the Asia Society. Jack, would you like to say a few words?
Good morning, everybody. We're pleased to have this debate. And basically, as Stape mentioned, it all came out of the launch of this report with Asia Society and Kissinger Institute, written by Dan and his colleague Thilo. We came out with this last month. And we have some copies of the report. It's on. You can find it also online. You can download it at the Asia Society website. Orville Schell, who was one of the big movers for this report, unfortunately can't be here today, but he wishes he would. But what happened when we launched the report? Afterwards, Dan and Thilo were up here with Stape, and Derek was sitting off to the left. And Derek has also done a lot of work on Chinese foreign investment, and he was kind of chomping at the bit. He got one question in, but that wasn't enough. So when Dan and I were walking out, I get this SMS, and it's from Derek. He says, "How about a debate between Dan and I?" And I turned to Dan. I said, "What do you think?" He said, "Great." So now we've got it today, and thanks to Stape for putting it together and Doug Spellman. So it should be interesting. So in one corner, I won't say he's the champion, but he's the lead contender is Dan, and we have the challenger in Derek. So it should be fun.
I got some remarks about to say about that.
Our format is going to be. Dan will lead off. We've given him up to 10 minutes to lay out his case regarding Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States. Derek will then have up to 10 minutes to make his response. We'll then have perhaps some give and take up here, and then we'll throw the floor open for input from the audience to explore this issue in greater depth. Dan, over to you.
Stape, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here for this. My gratitude to the Wilson Center, which was my very first job while I was in grad school, working for Mary Bullock here at the center when it was back on the mall, and we had sherry on Friday afternoons. I hope that still happens. And the Asia Society for its dedication to the topic we're here to discuss. It's a pleasure to be up here with Derek in particular, who's a longtime friend and fellow scholar of what's happening in China and U.S.-China relations. He and I have far more in common on this issue than we have different between us. But we'll do our best to find the differences to make it fun to spend time with us here this morning. The arrival of Chinese outbound foreign direct investment around the world, as with other aspects of China's economic recovery from the debacle of the pre-reform era that they are still recovering from, presents the United States with consequences, both good and bad, for our economic primacy in the world as others get back on their feet, and also presents us with choices to make about how we are to respond to that economic development. To kick off the discussion of the topic of outbound direct investment this morning, I'll make just 3 points for consideration for yours and Derek's to get us started about the nature of these Chinese companies going abroad now, really for the first time, arriving on U.S. shores. The first point I want to make is that whatever conclusions we draw about American interests with regard to this investment should be based on clear information and analysis of what is actually happening coming out of the Chinese side and as regards the American interest. Not fear-mongering, racial profiling, or defeatism about the merits of capitalism in a world which has some economies that prefer a greater degree of state involvement in the economy than we prefer in the United States. And it's possible to apply that level of analysis now with the right kind of homework, looking at what's actually happening in terms of Chinese investment trends. Second point I'm going to make is that based on that better information about what's actually happening rather than what we fear or are concerned about, we can start to see patterns in China's outbound direct investment which are diverse, largely non-strategic and commercial in their nature, and can be understood in terms of what American interests are. So we can match up the pattern of what's happening with what we think our interests are in this area. And thirdly, the third point I want to make, and I'll finish with, is that we can maintain America's traditional role as a beacon for international economic openness and competition rather than revert to a kind of isolationist attitude. We don't need to believe that the Chinese government is going to put American interests over their own in order to reach that conclusion and stand by those really eternal American principles about our economic organization. We only have to make sure that we have a strong enough system to address whatever challenges might be inherent in this outflow investment from China. Those are the 3 points I'm going to make to you, and I'm going to spend another 5 minutes just walking through a few slides which describe those 3 phenomena. First of all, in terms of the availability of clear information with which to grapple, let's consider the numbers. This is what is actually happening in terms of Chinese outbound direct investment. And mind you, direct investment means greenfield factory building and M&A. It doesn't mean investing in treasuries or securities less than 10% ownership of companies. That sort of stuff is called portfolio investment. It's not what we're talking about here this morning. This is the picture of China's outbound investment. Until the mid-2000s, there's practically nothing. Poor developing countries don't do it, can't do it, and China didn't do it. Only come the mid-2000s did the absolute crisis of urgency in China's need for raw materials, energy, impel them to start making direct investments around the world. And they happened almost entirely in developing countries that were resource exporters, not in advanced economies like the United States. In 2003, the first year in the data set that we explore in the publication that Jack and Stape described to get us started, this was the total set of Chinese direct investments in America. It was virtually absent here. It wasn't part of the story at all, even while it started to take off in places like Africa, Brazil, Kazakhstan, and the like. This is 2003 to 2005. It starts to get a little more. 2007, 2009, 2010, 2010. Now we're looking at the first quarter and we're seeing a continuation of this trend. So the first thing to understand is that we're not talking about something that might happen tomorrow. We are talking about a change in Chinese capabilities, Chinese company capabilities to invest in more advanced economies that is happening now. So this is a present situation. It's not a future maybe sort of thing. And most of that investment will happen without ever getting any kind of review for national security. Only sensitive sectors are going to go before what's called the CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and only when they're merger and acquisition investments. Greenfield investments, and there are quite a bit of the Chinese investment as greenfield, don't get a CFIUS review. So we shouldn't kid ourselves to think that the majority of these inflows from China is even parsable using our current national security review system, or needs to be. That's my first point. The second point I want to make is getting into the patterns we can see in what's transpiring. This is the distribution of the 250 or so investments that have happened from China since 2003. And when we start looking at the numbers in some detail here, and this is all in the study, you'll find this in our publication, the first thing that strikes us is that this is not a China that's simply cherry-picking out a very tiny number of high-tech industries. The pattern of investment inflow we're seeing is really across the spectrum of the economy. And in many cases, it matches up with the things China's best at already, not just with the things where it has no presence or no capability. So what we see is Chinese firms moving downstream a bit in the industries where they're already dominant as a manufacturer. We see them doing things that pretty much anybody can do if you have enough capital, and they're easy to do, like investing in utilities, which are like a fixed income investment, really. AES Energy, Intergen in Massachusetts now, the shale gases even. These are things that the Chinese know how to do. They're not putting commercial aircraft in the sky. So we see a very broad distribution, a mix of manufacturing and services, a mix of higher technology and lower technology, mirroring the breadth of China's existing economy rather than some picture of government aspiration to cherry pick out high-tech America. And when my colleagues and I look at the patterns of investment we see happening, it matches up with what you'd expect from a commercially motivated economy, not one that was run by a star chamber of Politburo officials trying to figure out how to improve China's technological capabilities. And in fact, that matches up with what we know about competition on the ground in China. Margins are getting squeezed tighter and tighter and tighter for Chinese companies, partly due to overcapacity in manufacturing and other factors. It's a complex story. For the first time, they have an incentive to go abroad in search of all the margins that Apple enjoys in Cupertino, rather than just being the 2%, 3% margin contract manufacturer with Foxconn back in China. So that describes what we see going on. The third point then to finish up that I wish to make is that the U.S., of course, needs a China policy not contingent on the expectation that Beijing has our best interests at heart and not its own. This is the numbers that describes the breakdown of the inflows into the United States we've seen thus far. And what we find is that by number of investments of 250, a data set of 250, about 70% or so of them are not government-controlled companies, but are private companies. Most of the individual deals being done are non-government Chinese firms, by which we mean less than 20% government ownership in China, coming to the United States to try to do business. 30% of them are greater than 20% Chinese state shareholding in the firm, so far as we can tell. By the value of the deals, it's more weighted to the government side. No surprise there. Government-related companies have better access to capital in China, and they're more clumped in the capital-intensive sector. So 2/3 of the investment coming in is from government-related firms. That doesn't really surprise me. But we have to ask ourselves now, is there some government-related threat laden in this picture of what's happening that we don't have a system designed to address or deal with? And I would argue that our system has, in fact, been forged over a century almost to address the possibility that there might be government motives amongst foreign investors, not always just commercial motives. There was concern about this pre-revolutionary America, that the steel mills here were British-owned and the cannonballs they would be making would be used against us. That turned out not to be the case. Those mills were pressed into service for Washington's army before the British knew what had happened to their tea in Boston Harbor. Between the wars, it was German chemical companies offering to come to America and build plants, and some here in D.C. saying we shouldn't let that happen because if we ever got into a scrap with the Germans, how could that ever happen, they said at the time, but if we did, maybe there would be sabotage or something such as that. Instead, those plants were taken away from those Germans, put under control of DuPont, which proceeded to make material for the other side in the great conflagration that came. So taking that forward to today through Middle Eastern investment in the 70s with petrodollars, Japanese in the 70s and 80s, all the claims down over the decades that somehow we wouldn't have a system that would look after the American interest turned out not to be the case. And the system that we've carefully protected and iterated and brought forward to date seems perfectly well suited to address the kinds of concerns one might find in a potential Chinese investment today. Final point I'll make, and I'll pass it over to Derek, is to remember, please, that the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, is not the end of U.S. government oversight of Chinese investment in America. It's just the very first bite at the apple. Once a Chinese company is established here, if it is, then it is fully subject to American counter-espionage law, national security law domestically. They'll be under the surveillance of U.S. law enforcement of all sorts and stripes, the same as any other company would. They have to abide by all competition policy law and other anti-competitiveness laws that all other firms have to abide by. So it's not the end of the story at all. It's not like it's our only chance to make sure that the firms operating here are operating in a manner which is consistent with our interests. And with that, let me stop, and I'll look forward to hearing what Derek's comments are.
Thanks, Dan. There are a lot of people to thank, but I, in a shocking development, have far too much to say, so I'm not going to thank them all. Two groups of people. One, if there's anyone upstairs in the overflow room, thank you. And if you feel like you have something to say and you didn't get a chance to say it, please come down after the end of the event. I'll be happy to talk to you. I'm sure Dan will as well. We appreciate your coming if there are, in fact, people up there. I also want to thank Dan for setting the stage for us because I did not want to go through all that. And he has high-tech stuff, and I have things like this, which you'll see later. Having said that, I will say one thing about Champion and Challenger. I started tracking Chinese outbound investment in 1999. Anyone here want to go that far back? So I think of myself as the champion, and Dan as the guy who gets all the publicity, which is where that resentful "let's have a debate" email came from. All right. In fact, Dan and I, as he correctly said, are not that different in judging the current situation, and not really at all different in judging the value of open investment. So I'm going to have to work through some things where it seems like, hey, where's the debate here, before I get to the point where we are very different, and importantly different, which is on U.S. policy. And I'll headline that now. The potential value of U.S. investment access to the PRC is not very well understood, potential value, and it's extremely large, potentially. That makes it a very powerful bargaining tool, and it's a unique bargaining tool because it is not coercive. We have other bargaining tools with the Chinese that are coercive, which have some drawbacks. We can get improvement in Chinese behavior, not perfect Chinese behavior, but improvement in Chinese behavior that most people in this room, and I think, without putting words in his mouth, including Dan, would want to see. We can win some of that in bargaining and solidify the U.S.-China relationship in the long run using investment access to the U.S. Now, I'm going to outline where my position fits in versus some others, but first I want to give you some facts. Heritage has a China Global Investment Tracker. It goes back to 2005. It does not just focus on the U.S. The advantage that it has over the research Dan and his colleagues have done is it is global. It's the same database and same methods applied to all countries, so you can make comparisons. It goes back, farther than some current work outside of Dan that's being done in New York. The disadvantage is it's shallow. It's $100 million and up only. So Dan's data on the U.S. is deeper. He has many more transactions. He can draw more nuanced conclusions. Another important difference is we include portfolio investment outside bonds. So, for example, there's a $5 billion stake that CIC bought in Morgan Stanley. We include that. It's not direct investment, and we include it anyway. Why? Because as a policy matter, heritage is one block from the U.S. Congress. Congress cares about that, so we include it. So there are differences in our data. They're instructive differences. I want to stipulate at the outset, Dan's data set for the U.S. is deeper. So that's why I don't have those pictures, because his pictures are going to be better. I am going to say that some things we're going to agree on because of the different data and some things we're going to disagree on. Chinese investment to this point is utterly trivial for American GDP and for the American economy. It's something like the equivalent of 0.2% of GDP. Luxembourg invests more, depending on how you count it. For it to become important, you're going to have to see a very strong performance by China going forward. And this is the first area where Dan's data and our data, I shouldn't say Dan's data because, as Dan pointed out, it's a group effort, but we'll say the data set presented in the paper, I'm going to have to call it Dan's data, that's too long. Dan's data and our data are different, I get all the publicity. Right, exactly. That thing that Dan did all by himself in a day. We have Chinese investment stable in 2010 because we count portfolio investment, which started in 2007. It was stable at $6 billion, a slightly larger number than Dan has. We have it on course to drop in 2011. We don't have a trend in the way we count it, different than the way Dan counts it, of a strong Chinese investment performance. Not yet. We have significant Chinese investment in 2009, 2010, but the trend now is not so clear. And this isn't actually a surprise because there are some drains on Chinese capital. We also have a different map. Because we include portfolio investment, Chinese investment in the U.S. on our count is dominated by finance and dominated by the state of New York. You saw some diversification in 2010, which was very encouraging and very healthy. But in 2011, we're not getting much in the way of transactions yet. We have a troubled transaction data set, which apply all over the world, not just in the U.S. In the U.S., you all are familiar with the cases. The CNOOC case is the emblematic one. There have been a lot of discussion of Huawei, but there's also Anshan's investment in steel development in Louisiana. There's an AVIC subsidiary investing in a private aircraft maker, in a small private aircraft maker in Minnesota. There are others. So there are notable problems in Chinese investments in the U.S., which is one of the reasons we're talking here. We also have different numbers for SOEs. Dan pointed out quite correctly that SOEs don't necessarily dominate by number of transactions. We have them dominating by volume. I mentioned that $5 billion investment in Morgan Stanley. Think about how that changes Dan's volume figures. Dan has about 2/3 of investment by SOEs. Our investment share for SOEs in the United States is much higher. And that is a big part of the debate. That, so why, on our count, which is a little different than Dan's, SOEs dominate by volume Chinese investment in the U.S. What does that mean? Does it mean anything? Now I'm going to use my high-tech props.
SOEs are state-owned enterprises. When you use these acronyms, it might be helpful to at least let us know what they mean before.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, there could be a lot of questions about what was he talking about. I'll try to slow down. I'm also going to have to move, so apologies to anyone who's inconvenienced by that. You don't have to move. Okay. So here's position one in my typology. Position one was represented to me 2 weeks ago in Beijing when a senior member of the Ministry of Commerce yelled at me for all the American barriers to Chinese investment. Not just me, he yelled at our whole group, unprovoked. We asked, what are your concerns about? And he started yelling, essentially. There are problems in Chinese investment in the U.S. The position that this is the main issue in U.S.-China investment is not tenable in the U.S. policy debate. It's really not tenable on the facts. There are people, nonetheless, who believe it or argue it as a bargaining position. I'm just laying this out because I had recent experience. If someone here wants to ask about all the Chinese, people use Huawei over and over again. What about Huawei? What about Huawei? Huawei is really not that important to anyone except Huawei and their PR firms. This is not really a serious position. It may be a bargaining position. It may be things that people bring up for public relations reasons. The idea that the main problems in U.S.-China investment relationship are American protectionism is not serious. Now, the second position is what I would call the unilateral position, which is, I'm just standing here by accident. I have no idea who represents this position. The unilateral position, which is, hey, let's make the decision based on what's best for the U.S. Stop obsessing over China. Right? We can talk about what's best for the U.S., and we can debate that, but that's how we make the decisions, based on what's best for the U.S. All right, now I'm going to skip over the correct position, which, of course, is right here, and go over, and I'm going to identify Jack with a group I don't think he wants to be identified with. So this is.
Could you get a microphone? It's not
Sorry.
coming up with the.
Can I speak a little louder? How about that?
Well, real loud.
Sure, I can speak real loud. All right, Jack is not identified with this position. Okay? We still having problems? I always cause these sorts of trouble. I don't like sitting still.
Maybe you could just hand one of those mics.
No, I don't think.
No, they're not going to reach.
This one might reach.
Nah, we got a mic coming. Sorry, everyone. This does not count against my 10 minutes. I formally disassociate Jack with this position. I think there are probably some people in the room who have this position. This is the American version of the problems in the investment relationship are all China. Right? China is a threat. Chinese investment in the U.S. is harmful. It's not maybe harmful. It's just harmful. On balance, we should not allow China to invest in the U.S. There are definitely people who believe that. I get email from them all the time. I'm thankful this is not a position that is represented in the U.S. Congress. We deal with the Congress all the time. They have problems. They have objections. They get angry. They don't think that Chinese investment is a net negative for the United States. So there are people who hold this position. I welcome questions from them. It's not a serious position in the policy debate. And I'm thankful for that. Now, the fourth position, and I don't know whether the ambassador wants to be associated with the position or not, but it's very respectable. And I want to argue a little bit against Dan here, even though this is not my view. This is
move over, Steve.
this is the reciprocity position. Reciprocity is the foundation of the WTO. Okay? The idea that reciprocity implies protectionism, I mean, any argument can be maligned and misused. But reciprocity is an entirely legitimate position to take. There's value to this position, as I agree there's value to Dan's position, even though I'm not going to adopt either one of them. My problem with reciprocity is we're not reciprocal investors. We don't want the same things the Chinese do. America doesn't have state-owned enterprises. We can't have matching regulations. We're not interested in the same sectors. So a blind application of reciprocity simply isn't going to work. It's not interesting. The U.S. and China are not mirror images. We want different things out of the investment relationship. We don't want the same rules. Reciprocity works in the WTO because there are many, many, many participants. With two participants, it's not the ideal solution, but it is a legitimate point to make. Now, this is how you know that this is the correct answer. It has a little asterisk next to it, star.
That means footnotes.
I'm reduced to a footnote. The Heritage Foundation is not used to being in the middle and compromising on anything, but that's where I ended up in this typology. This is actually the right position, and I'll tell you why. There are substantive and technical differences that I have with Dan, but we do agree that China's investment is good for the U.S. and has the potential to be substantial over time. We disagree on policy, and I'll tell you where the disagreement comes from. Everybody who's in this community, the people up here, the people out there, certainly myself, has had this experience of how do we get China to change its behavior economically? We want the Chinese to change. We want them to move toward the market. I have a long argument that the Chinese have been moving away from the market for a good 5 or 6 years now. But even if you don't buy that, we want China to move. And when you're talking to members of Congress, people in the administration, people in this room, everybody in the community, you always have this problem of where's our leverage? And there's an answer. The U.S. has huge leverage. It's all negative. We threaten them. We cut off their market access. We punish them. And people are rightly uncomfortable with this. Okay? That it undermines the existing it undermines U.S. economy to some extent, but more to the point, it undermines the existing international system. We now have an example of non-coercive, not directly coercive leverage, and that's Chinese investment access to the U.S. We have coal, we have natural gas, we have metals, we have managerial expertise, which China needs in almost every service industry you can name. We have so much land that we're not land sensitive like the Australians are, the Canadians are, a lot of countries are. The history of Chinese outward investment is not, and some people in this room might know this, but if you're new to it, is not a history of diversification. It's a history of we want to invest in the U.S., and we couldn't because of the CNOOC deal, and so that's when we started looking elsewhere. Right? Why? Why does the U.S. have this potentially unique role? Australia, Canada, there are other countries that have resources, that have investor protections, but they don't have scale. We have a scale to absorb Chinese investment that no other country can even get close to matching. Forget about new Chinese investment. Not that it's not important, and Dan's not right to talk about it. People are always talking about China diversifying out of treasuries. There's exactly one country in which China can diversify out of treasuries to us. They can only diversify out of one set of U.S. assets to another set of U.S. assets. That's what $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves means. If China wants to diversify, this is it. So we have something that is potentially, not now, extremely valuable to the Chinese. And it's a positive inducement to change Chinese behavior. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going to get China to do whatever we want. That's ridiculous. But one thing, and there are lots of things that are connected to inward investment, we'd really like to reduce and change the role of state-owned enterprises. This is a legitimate American concern. It has a lot of impact on U.S. trade as well, imports into China. It distorts the world economy given China's size. It's directly related to your inward investment in the U.S. So is intellectual property. You don't want to change state-owned enterprises? We have another front you can change. On a more technical basis, so is the capital account. You want a free Chinese investment flow into the U.S.? How about free flow of money in and out of China? All of these things are connected. They're huge issues for the United States. We have felt that we have lacked leverage, or at least positive leverage, to move China. It's been a frustration of probably every member of Congress, and I'm sure most of the people in the room. This is an opportunity. It's not reciprocity. Simple reciprocity doesn't work. We don't have the same interests. This is an opportunity. It's a unique opportunity because it's not a coercive tool. All right, now I'm going to make the strong point. Dan's blowing it. The unilateral approach blows this opportunity. We agree, we get to the end, and here we disagree. I want to discuss the practical and principled arguments against this position, but I'll tell you what my trump card is. You want to stop politicization of U.S. investment, you want to open the U.S. to China really, not just talk about it, my argument wins in Congress. Not because I made it, because Congress wants something in return. Thank you.
Dan, 5 minutes to comment and response.
Okay. I really just want to make 2 points, I think, in response to what I just heard. And one of the great things about America is the mobility, social mobility, and even political mobility, how different organizations on the spectrum where you'd expect to find them can evolve over time. I'm struck by what Derek just laid out, because and I hate to say this, at the Wilson Institute, which is really the hearth of liberalism in America, and yet not all from that liberalism brought us stood the test of time. And there are two antiquated liberal international notions, which Derek apparently ascribes to, which I think we shouldn't go backwards to. The first is the notion that the American purpose in the world is to change everybody else and to save them and to make them better like us. That our success, that our principles, whether we're for democracy or not, whether we're for capitalism or not, open investment and trade or not, depends on whether we can convert others to the cause. Whether Ricardo was right or not, that it's good for England to be open to trade, even if not everybody in the world is open to trade. That turned out to be correct, and I think that's still the correct notion. Derek seems to believe that unless we can convince Beijing to follow our mode of Anglo-American capitalism, which has shown some tarnish in the past couple years, we should be willing to withdraw aspects of our longstanding conviction about open global investment flows and the trade flows that are contingent upon the ability to invest in one another's economies. So I have great concern about this. And also, my wife's a psychiatrist, actually, up in New York. And it took me a long time within my own family to realize that my happiness can't really be predicated on changing everybody else in my family. At some point, you have to kind of accept that they are what they are. Hopefully, your example and what you do in life gives reason people to meditate on doing things differently than how they're doing them. But you can't really predicate what you do, your principles, on that, on others mirroring you at the end of the day. So that's one old sort of liberal American manifest destiny conceit, which my realist and realpolitik teachers disabused me of back in grad school, and I remain in a more kind of Kissingerian camp than Derek appears to be on this. The second point I want to make is this, that to paraphrase what he just said, I believe he was quoting former Governor Blagojevich in saying, this thing is golden, I'm going to use it. So we got this thing, which is called access to the American market. And if we don't get from the Chinese what we want, we're not going to let them have it. Now, the problem with that kind of politics is that it is a regulatory taking from somebody else in America. Some American company has an asset, and they want to sell it to whomever is willing to pay the highest price. And some other American company has an issue in China, market access, investment, something like that, that they want to get taken care of. And so they're going to the U.S. government, and the U.S. government is going to prevent some other unrelated company from being able to sell its oil company or its whatever other assets it has to the highest bidder in order to get a trade-off on behalf of some other U.S. firm. Once you open up that box and start playing that game of taking away the market opportunities from some firms in order to fight a battle overseas for market access for some other firms, I don't know where it ends, actually. And I don't know how you go back and fix the arithmetic to make everybody whole from that kind of state intervention in economic outcomes. It may be that the tools and analysis that Heritage has been able to develop now permit us to do that kind of intervention without screwing things up. But I'm still skeptical of that, and I'd like to see a little better evidence that we're ready to take that on before I endorse the idea of using this new positive leverage or whatever Derek described it as to get some other things done for some other interested parties. Finally, that the principles the U.S. stands by only matter to a company like Huawei because it's just one company. And it's in telecoms, and everybody has misgivings about telecom companies anyway, right? But that's all that matters. It doesn't matter to anybody else. I just really am very concerned about that. For example, one of the things said about Huawei is that its senior management has military background, for instance, and therefore it really should be treated as a special case. I've recently looked over the American companies in the Fortune 500, and I've considered how many of them have in their C-suites, in their chairman's office and his top reports, people with military backgrounds in the United States. And I think there are about 40 or 50 Business Roundtable leading firms that are going to find themselves put under a kind of scrutiny in China because of their senior management that we're very uncomfortable with if we decide to play that game because Huawei is the only company that should care about how U.S. policy reads out on an issue like this. Let me stop there.
Okay.
Derek, 5 minutes
Thank
to...
you. So we can get into more of the debate now. It'll be more entertaining. It'll probably less informative. Dan is labeling me with he's reciprocity bashing, and he's labeling me as one of those people. I'm not trying to change China to fit in our image. I'm trying to change China because we're going to gain from changing China. This is pursuing the national interest, right? I mean, Dan thinks he's pursuing the national interest, and I think he's blowing a gigantic opportunity to pursue the national interest. There's no Wilsonian idealism. There are things that the U.S. has wanted from China for years, very badly. Most of the people in the room, I think, want them, although they may not agree with me on the ways to get them. And we haven't had a way to think about doing that other than threatening the Chinese. And now this is a way. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a way to improve the U.S.-China relationship for the long term. So this isn't about changing China. This is about a gain for the United States. Dan is a very colorful and engaging speaker, and he always opens opportunities and for a colorful, engaging response. Only in my case, I always go too far. But the marriage comparison, as a practical matter, you don't just accept people, your spouse the way they are necessarily, because there's the danger of divorce, right? And there's a danger of divorce in the U.S.-China relationship. And so the idea that, okay, well, they're the way they are and we're the way we are and that's the way it is, not everybody in this city agrees with that. And there might not be people who are elected president, whoever it is, in 2012 who agrees with that. What we want to do here, and I think Dan would agree with the outcome, just not the means, is strengthen the relationship. That's what I'm looking to do here, looking to make the relationship more beneficial for the United States because it's in our interest, and strengthen the relationship because it prevents the kind of potential tension that you could see between the two sides. Now, the great thing about Dan's response is that I now want to be associated with Governor Blagojevich more than I want to be with Secretary of State Kissinger. I was aware of not necessarily wanting to be associated with Secretary of State Kissinger. I wasn't aware that I wanted to be associated with Governor Blagojevich, but I've been enlightened. Talking about state intervention and how much it would distort the American economy or potentially, There was no Chinese investment in this country essentially in 2005. We blocked the big one. Did the U.S. economy suffer? Did it require this gigantic regulatory apparatus? No. Didn't it suffer in 2006? It didn't suffer in 2007. It didn't suffer in 2008. This is a straw man Dan's creating about the things that we would have to do. Well, we didn't do them, and we haven't done them, and they haven't been necessary. All right, so I'm just going to push that aside. I'm also going to push Huawei aside because I don't care about Huawei. If we turn this discussion into a debate about Huawei, it serves the people who want to have a bad U.S.-China relationship. It serves the people who want to use Huawei to hit the United States over the head and say, you're not open, you're not open, you're not open, therefore we in China can be excused in anything we do. It serves people in the United States who want to say, look, it's a bunch of Chinese military people trying to take over the American economy. So I don't want to talk about Huawei because it's a distraction. And it's a distraction that people who are not in favor of a better investment relationship often use. Dan obviously is, but it is often used that way. I do want to talk about something sort of related to Huawei, which is in Dan's original remarks. Dan characterizes Chinese investment in the U.S. as commercial, non-strategic. I think that's probably right about the U.S., but I think it's misleading. Why? Because Chinese strategic investment, non-commercial investment around the world is really about resource acquisition. And the reason that Chinese investment in the U.S. isn't about resource acquisition is because we wouldn't let them acquire the resources. So we're getting confused. We have an outcome of Chinese investment in the U.S. which doesn't look particularly strategic or insidious or anything like that. But part of that is due to the fact of American restrictions. If China were allowed to invest freely in the United States, you would see a resource focus. You would see strategic acquisitions. The Go Out program is government-directed, dominated by state firms. Right? So I don't think, this is where I disagree with positions 4 and 5 over here, that just because that it's strategically directed and non-commercial in a lot of respects, that means it's bad for the U.S. and we have to block it. But I do think one of Dan's opening statements is a little misleading. Chinese investment around the world is in fact strategic. It is often non-commercial. It's different in the U.S. mostly because we've restricted it to some extent, perhaps unwisely. I certainly think in some cases unwisely. But let's not fool ourselves. If we open the doors to Chinese investment, either in exchange for my bargain to improve the American economic position or unilaterally, we're going to get a lot of strategic investment. We're going to get a lot of Chinese SOEs here. I'm going to wrap up. That's why we need something in return politically. This is not going to get better. It's going to get worse. Lots of SOEs investing in this country. It's going to make the political strains worse. Regardless, I agree with Dan. They're going to follow the rules. We have laws to deal with them. We need something politically in the United States to strengthen this relationship because the future of Chinese investment in the U.S., if we open the doors, is strategic, it is non-commercial, and it is led by SOEs.
We seem to have identified an area of difference, which has to do with the question of whether foreign direct investment offers leverage possibilities. Perhaps we could explore this a little further in order to try to understand it. The United States is a major investor abroad. Presumably then, if we can use Chinese foreign direct investment interest in coming into the United States as a lever, foreign countries where the United States wants to engage in foreign direct investment can use that leverage back against us. Can we explore this a little further? In other words, what are the implications of treating foreign direct investment as leverage? Another question has to do, much of the foreign investment, including Chinese, but broader than that, simply comes into the United States without being under any particular regulatory regime. It has to conform with U.S. domestic laws. But U.S. states, for example, are very active in trying to attract foreign direct investment into the states because it creates jobs, it creates tax revenues. How does the federal government get control of this type of investment so that it can use it as leverage? Or do we only use leverage in circumstances where government approval of the investment is required in some form? Both of you are free to comment in these areas.
I, for some reason, feel these questions were aimed largely at me. Reciprocity, it doesn't affect, there are implications for investment around the world that we'd have to think about. It certainly doesn't affect U.S. investment into China because the Chinese already use their investment market as a bargaining chip. They used it from the beginning. They use it all the time. They use it with companies. They use it with countries all over the place. So that doesn't mean that the U.S. should do it just because China does it. That's not why I'm advocating it. I'm advocating it as to win gains in the U.S.-China economic relationship that the United States has wanted for a long time. But it's not going to affect our relationship with China if we use reciprocity because they're already using reciprocity. It's an interesting question I haven't thought about, and maybe Dan, because he's more motivated, will point out, are there complications to this? And my initial reaction would be no. I could be wrong, but no, because, as I said, reciprocity is a fundamental principle in the WTO. Right? So it's not as if the United States has gone crazy about this by adopting this idea of we want something in return. But there could be complications, and that's a fair point to raise. So I'll let Dan try to make that argument. It's certainly not going to affect our relationship with China. They're already doing it. With regards to the regulatory review, I mean, this is a big, I didn't get into this in my points, and I think Dan might have done the same thing because it gets very technical and very boring. We already have a review process of Chinese investment in the United States. It's called the Congress. The Congress just kind of reaches out and reviews anything at once and discourages it and makes trouble. That's not the ideal situation. I would like that situation to change regardless of whether we can make progress with China. But the leverage comes from the fact that we have political interference, and it's unfortunate political interference. We can create a regulatory review process that I think is better than the process we have now that would also give us leverage. So I would separate the leverage question from the review question. We have the leverage. It's given to us by congressional interference. That's not ideal. But if we created a regulatory process to kind of regularize entry by Chinese money, that would also be leverage. We can have leverage either way. We could improve our own regulatory environment, I think Dan would agree, by limiting random congressional acts.
Let me say that I think the threat, this saber-rattling threat that the Congress will interfere with these deals if we don't get what we want in our negotiations with the Chinese, is not a wise strategy, American-China strategy to achieve our interests. It hasn't really worked very effectively for the decades I've been watching the relationship. And moreover, more important than congressional saber-rattling is law, which Congress is also responsible for. And statutorily, under U.S. law passed by Congress, there is only one mandate for the United States in screening inward direct investment, and that is the national security. Derek, I believe, agrees with me that there does not appear to be any particular China national security threat from the inward investment we're seeing to date. He hasn't debated that or taken that on. Instead, he's saying that quite apart from that issue of national security, we might be able to get something else done unrelated to national security in China that's of a commercial nature of our interests in the course of allowing this Chinese investment in. Maybe Congress would like to debate that and enshrine it in U.S. law. But in fact, for a century, the Congress has been debating this issue, and that's the way the American system works. We need to work these things out in legislation and then have them signed into law by the president. And we have a regime that is the official United States position on inward investment, and has worked very much to the American advantage. Derek pointed out that in 1999, there wasn't very much Chinese direct investment in the United States, or 2005 for that matter. But look at 1900, look at 1800. Foreign investment in the United States has played a profound and important and positive role in our economy since before our founding as a nation. I don't think the fact that China is only now at the developmental stage where it is starting to be a significant outward investor should be used to write off the importance, both in terms of the specific case of China and in terms of the principle, which the U.S., we're only a nation of 300 million people in a big planet, and American interests rest on our principles and what we believe in, what we've stood for, and the fidelity which people around the world have had toward our ideas, the soft power of our good ideas that have proven themselves to work. If we throw those by the side, willy-nilly in this case, I think we do ourselves a global disservice, which will definitely come back to haunt us in seeable and unforeseen ways.
I just want to respond to that. Maybe it's the word willy-nilly that got me going there. Of course, what are we trying to bargain for? We're not trying to bargain for unilateral U.S. advantage. We're trying to bargain for the same principles that Dan holds dear and I do too that govern the American economy. So it's not that we've departed from our principles to gain some selfish U.S. interests. We departed from our principles to get free markets all over the world, to promote the free flow of investment, or to promote the protection of intellectual property. I mean, we're taking our principles. We're not demanding anyone do something. We're saying, with bargaining, that's what the WTO round is. That's what why do we have an SNED? Well, actually, I'm not clear sometimes why we have an SNED. But in principle, we would be bargaining. And we're bargaining for the exact principle of open markets that you're talking about. I am not looking to usher in protectionism. I'm not looking to gain a special advantage for the U.S. and China. I'm looking for China to move toward principles that the U.S. has stood for a long time because it's a gain for us. We're standing by our principles and our own self-interest.
Well, no, you are saying, though, that we need to depart from our principles in order to protect our principles.
No, bargaining is not departing from our principles. I mean, why would, we're trying to get to an outcome that is consistent with principles more broadly, right? You're looking at one section saying, that's why I called it unilateral. You're looking at one element of what the U.S. stands for, or one application of what the U.S. stands for, and acting as if that's the end goal. But that's not the end goal. The end goal is we get a broad range of open markets. We have broad application of our principles to our economic relationship, not just in one area.
Let's open the floor and see whether your basic presentation of the issue, which, if I may summarize, is basically China foreign direct investment is good, but how we should adopt a policy response to it, there are differences between the two presenters. Let's start over here against the wall. Yes, please identify yourself.
Yes, Carrie Dunbar. Is this on? Is this on? Can anybody hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay.
But they can't.
Carrie Dunbar from CNA. I have a question.
Yeah, Carrie, let's get the mic problem fixed so that in case there are viewers upstairs and elsewhere.
Is there another microphone here? Yeah.
There it goes. No, there's one coming.
How about the, oh, yes, even I can hear me. Carrie Dunbar from CNA. I have a question, really, I want to address to both of you. Both of you have talked about the U.S. Congress. And this is, the U.S. Congress is really something that can cut both ways. For many years, Congress was objecting to the U.S.-China economic relationship because they saw, jobs going overseas and American investment overseas. Based on Dan's map now, since 2003, we've had suddenly investment coming into these states, and each of these states is made up of congressional districts. How do each of you see what kind of an influence this might have on Congress's attitudes? Are we going to have more of a negative attitude like with the CNOOC, or are members of Congress going to see this investment as really in the interests of their district? Can you comment on that?
First of all, I think one thing that I very much agree with Derek about is that it's very early days, that I wouldn't say trivial anymore, but we're still very much in early days in terms of the total value of Chinese investment in the American states. It is growing at an extremely steep clip. If you just look at direct investment, it's 130% year-on-year growth in the past 2 or 3 years, leaving aside the conflation with the portfolio numbers for the moment. And so we have to see how it's going to play through the American political economy. It will be fascinating to see whether the Chinese professor pops back up in the presidential election campaigning the way he did last time around. I bet he will, but we'll have to see how much resonance there is. We've seen already National Governors Association, Western Governors Association have a very different take on what these inflows from Chinese firms mean for their states and their districts. A much more positive attitude, a readiness to focus on the benefits and be more, ask for more specific explanation. If somebody thinks there's a national security threat, Derek doesn't, but others do, including some on the Hill. And the governors are starting to say, show me what that threat is and why our system isn't adequate to address it, because it's not clear to me what that would be. I think we're going to see a more balanced discourse, in other words, as more local interests, which are cognizant of the job effects, the local tax base effects, make sure that their voice is in the mix and are more ready to stand up and say, hey, this has actually worked out pretty well for us locally.
I had an answer. I mostly agree with Dan and the thrust of your question, Carrie. There is this possibility. I get questions almost every day from a local delegation going to China. Do you have anything to tell me, the state officials? So I think that's a phenomenon a lot of people have seen in this room. So that is starting to happen. It's not, as Dan pointed out, it's too early. The volume of Chinese investment as yet is too small to weigh against, if you believe China's currency policy is taking away millions of American jobs. I don't. But if you believe that, or if you believe other Chinese practices are taking away American jobs, which I think is much more reasonable, the Chinese investment is not yet a political counterweight to that, at least in the Congress. And we could see it grow into something of a counterweight. It's a ways away yet. So the question, if you're asking me, hey, could we manage the U.S.-China relationship for a while to such that we don't get any precipitous American action and Chinese investment then becomes a potent political force in the U.S., yeah, maybe. I'll give you one little story that weighs against that. We had a Chinese delegation come in to Heritage right after the crisis hit, and I gave the usual story, which is the one you just gave, that politically it would really help in the U.S. if there was more Chinese investment, because it would create jobs and we wouldn't get all this lost jobs story when unemployment is rising. And the leader of the delegation said, one of our reviews of outward investment is it has to have a gain for China. And then one of the points in our reviews is, why are you creating jobs overseas that you could create here? Chinese unemployment is actually much worse than American unemployment, little understood fact. There are domestic political pressures in China too. Dan is not making this point, but if you thought that China is not investing strategically, it would be very difficult to get an outcome. You'd have to get government orders to get mass job creating investment in the U.S. That's not what the Chinese are looking to do, not what Chinese companies are looking to do. So I think it's going to be a long time because of China's own interests, which are entirely reasonable, before Chinese investment becomes enough of a political force to offset the traditional political forces in the U.S. Doesn't mean the traditional political forces screaming about lost jobs to China are going to force a policy change. It just means that this counterweight you're talking about is going to be a while developing.
We have a number of questions from the overflow room, but I thought we'd take one or two more questions here, and then I'll go to the overflow questions. Yes. Do we have a microphone?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Pat Malloy. I'm a member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, but I was also involved in 1988 in writing the law, the CFIUS, that provides that national security when I was general counsel of the Senate Banking Committee. As I look at it, both the WTO and the IMF, their preambles talk about mutually beneficial and balanced trade. Now, Warren Buffett wrote an article in Fortune magazine in October 2003, and it was entitled this: "Trade deficits are selling the country out from under us." Warren Buffett wrote that. And he said, by running massive trade deficits year after year, you're sending dollars outside of the country, which they're not coming back to buy your goods, they're going to come back and buy you. And he said the road we're on is to become not a shareholder economy, but a sharecropper economy where the other guy owns it and we work with him. That's what Warren Buffett has talked about. Now, since 2001, the United States has run $6 trillion worth of trade deficits, $2 trillion with China. Since 1979, when we gave China MFN, we've run about $3 trillion worth of trade deficits. Very interesting. China has about $3.1 trillion in foreign currency reserves. Chris Cox, who was the former chairman of the SEC, when he spoke about this issue, said traditionally in America, we have not wanted our own government to own large chunks of our own economy. He said on the road we're on, where we're going to let Chinese state-owned enterprises and Chinese-owned companies and sovereign wealth funds owned by the government of China, we're going to end up with a foreign government owning large chunks of our economy.
Pat, could you phrase your question?
Okay, so the question is this the kind of road that the United States wants to be on, or should we not make it a matter of very importance that we begin to rebalance our trade and move toward a balanced trade policy so we can stop the selling off of America to finance our trade deficits?
Either of you want to?
Pat, let me offer this. I think, is this the road we want to be on? I think if, in order to remedy its competitiveness challenges, the United States needs to block out holders of our dollars, of our currency, that earned them by manufacturing stuff that we bought. If we have to keep them from bringing them back to America and using them in our economy to buy something, whether an asset or a good, then what does that say about our prospects as an economy? That, to me, is the road to serfdom. The one where you remain exposed to competitive players out there, even if they're doing really well this inning, I think is the only one that's consistent with American long-term interests. That if we don't adjust our policy regimes and our competitiveness in light of competitive new players in the world economy, then I don't know what alternative we really have, I don't think. And indeed, there are aspects of China's competitiveness which aren't market-oriented in the way that we play the game. No question about that. But also, let's remember which economy has allowed itself to be more open to foreign investment than any other in the world in the past 40 years, and that's China, which has 1.5 trillion of foreign direct investment assets in its economy, which relative to the size of its GDP is just vastly large. Every big American company has a big position in China. American telecom companies built the Chinese telecom system to a great extent. American car companies are building their automotive economy to a great extent. We can argue about whether they get a fair shake, but if they applied the same fear of sharecropper outcome test that you just suggested, they would never have allowed Motorola to go to China, or GM, or Ford, or anybody else.
But the American companies invested in China are not government-owned companies.
Pat says, just for the benefit of folks upstairs, that the American companies invested in China are not government-owned companies. We, as you know, Pat, because you've been involved in the legislation, have considered over the years whether to treat government-owned companies different in terms of their right to invest in the United States. And we've chosen not to. We have a slightly higher degree of screening for them under FENSA after Dubai, just dating back 3 or 4 years. But that's only for screening for national security. It doesn't have to do with them as an owner and a player in the American economy. We've chosen not to take that route of having a two-tier system. And it's worked pretty well for us to date, I would argue.
Derek, do you have?
Yeah, quickly, Pat, you and I have talked about the imbalances. I just want to make one point for everyone else's benefit. You're talking about your fear of China is really a long-term fear. SOEs are so far away from owning a noticeable chunk of the American economy. I mean, it's just decades, not years. Your real fear now is not China, it's us. We're messing ourselves up. And so, this is a little bit off topic, but I don't want you to mix up what might happen in the future with Chinese investment. And because I distrust Chinese SOEs too, but that danger is a long, long way off with what you're worried about now, which is really 10 years of bad American economic policy.
Hank Levine.
Hi, Hank Levine with the Albright Stonebridge Group. Just wanted to offer a very brief comment on Derek's views, but then pose a question to Dan, actually related, excuse me, to the state ownership question. On Derek's views, I'd just say that it just strikes me that there is perhaps an undervalue or an underweighting of the potential downside risk of your proposed policies. And that is to say that the historical record, I think, of the U.S. government using so-called leverage excuse me, in the economic area to change Chinese behavior is pretty poor, whether it was negotiations in the 90s on IPR before China was a WTO member, and we could slap tariffs on them willy-nilly, to use that phrase, whether it was President Clinton's effort to link MFN renewal to human rights. It hasn't worked. And it just strikes me that the more likely outcome of the course that you're suggesting is the U.S. then foregoing the benefits of the inward Chinese investment and U.S. companies, both investors and exporters, suffering mightily in China as the Chinese retaliate for what they perceive to be a discrimination against them in the U.S. So it just seems to me the downside risk here perhaps is a bit undervalued. But for Dan, at the rollout event here for your report, actually, there was, I recall, a representative from the steel industry who posed what to me was an interesting question. And while I sort of, emotionally kind of agree with the notion of not discriminating between types of ownership of inward investment, the question arises, let's take the steel industry, to the extent that you have a Chinese state-owned steel company which can come and invest in the U.S. and then using cheap credit and other types of Chinese support, Chinese government support, could then theoretically be in a position over a period of time to drive their U.S. competitors out of the market, companies that face the rigors of the market. To what extent do you see this as a potential threat or a likelihood or an issue of concern?
Thanks, Hank. It's a good question, and it's a sensitive one and an important one. I'll say this, that the final point I made in my opening remarks was that the CFIUS process is just the first bite at the apple that the United States has. And once we've decided that there's no classic national security threat to the United States from a foreign firm, be it, say, Anshan Steel or Tianjin Steel or something like that, investing here, we're not done assessing the behavior of that firm. There are many other kinds of threats to the American economy which are governed under U.S. law. One of them is anti-competitive practices, predatory intent on behalf of a firm using its superior access to capital or resources or something else to drive other companies out of business in a way that would be deleterious to the U.S. interest. So if there's any evidence of that driving competitors out, there's a good chance that the Justice Department would invoke U.S. competition law, anti-monopolies law, to address that behavior in the sector, as they would against an American steel company that was doing the same thing, such as in the trust busting that gave birth to competition law, 120 years ago. Also, there's the anti-subsidies code under the WTO, that allows us to look at the capital structure behind Chinese firms, and if it's being provided to those firms in a discriminatory way back home that's clearly designed to help them achieve an export objective, let's say, then we have those tools as well, which are more multilateral, which we can pursue. If it turns out that there's some new kind of economic poison associated with Chinese companies in the world today, because China really is different than anything that's come before, if we can identify a new kind of economic phenomena associated with these Chinese state-owned enterprises, then certainly let's do a study on it. Let's think about what that threat is. Nobody's been able to really identify it yet. As Derek said, there's such a tiny pittance of Chinese global investment to date compared to existing multinational company investment that it's hard to actually put your finger on any such abuse of market power yet. It's a fear factor that what might happen rather than looking at evidence of things that's happening.
I just want to respond quickly to your comment. I agree that the U.S. government has a decent chance of not implementing this properly. Where we disagree is that there's a risk, pretty much, I'm at the Heritage Foundation. Anything the U.S. government does is probably going to get messed up.
You're advocating doing a lot more.
I don't think I am. That's one of our disagreements. But what I disagree with you is the idea that the fear of Chinese retaliation should prevent us from trying, or even that there is that much of a risk of Chinese retaliation. All those attempted linkages didn't work on the U.S. side. They didn't really cause that much retaliation on the Chinese side. The real issue here is whether you think the status quo is okay. If you think the status quo is okay in the U.S.-China relationship, it's not really worth it to try to take this issue, as Dan points out. There's some drawbacks of trying to use this. If you think the status quo in the U.S.-China relationship is really bad, then it is worth it, even though the U.S. government might mess it up. So my response to your question is I don't think the downside risk is so high, but if you think the status quo is fine, then why do it? If you think the status quo is not fine, then you have pretty powerful motivation.
I'm going to move to the overflow room and combine three questions which have a linked content. What are the national security implications for the United States of Chinese foreign direct investment in Latin America and Africa? And if Chinese investments over and across countries are they becoming more or less strategic? And if Chinese investment in the United States is strategic and non-commercial, what are its strategic objectives?
Okay, I will point out again that we have a global database and Dan doesn't. So we know the numbers for Chinese investment in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa being the concern about a couple of years ago, now Latin America being the prime concern. I think the national security implications are summarized by if you snooze, you lose. We have opportunities to improve our economic relationships with these countries. We have the Colombia and Panama free trade agreements sitting there year after year after year after year. If you're really worried about Chinese economic ties to these countries, expand American economic ties to these countries. It's the no-brainer of the century. So yes, there could be national security implications of Chinese investment in these countries, but it mostly has to do with our own passivity, inaction, opposition to open trade. It mostly has to do with us more than China. I think I'll leave the strategic part of the investment in the U.S. to Dan because he does have better data there. The Chinese investment overseas is actually, it looks like, becoming a little less directed. The original go out was just a big resource grab, which is the way a lot of people characterize Chinese investment, and there's still a lot of that. Don't get me wrong. The largest state investors by China are the two state-owned oil companies. CIC, the sovereign wealth fund, one of the sovereign wealth funds, is third. Next is the fourth oil company. The next is Chinalco, an aluminum company. There's a lot of resource grabbing going on. It looks like, looking global data for the last 7 years, it looks like you're starting to get more large investments by private firms and more diversification. If you took the whole sum of it, and you're talking to the people, you're still going to get, it looks directed, it looks strategic, it's all state-dominated, no doubt about it. It looks like that's starting to ease, and a very perceptive question by whoever asked it. I'm not saying anything definitive because I like lots of data, and as we both pointed out, there's not that much data.
Careful what you ask for, Derek, because we've got a global study coming out at the end of the year from the Peterson Institute.
Years late.
Apples and oranges. Clear cut.
The only differences we're interested in are on the subject of this report.
All right. Dude, that channel's to be continued. We have, somewhat surprisingly to me, already established here that we don't really think there's much of a strategic impulse in the pattern of Chinese investment in the United States to talk about here at this table. Well, yet, I guess, but if there does not appear to be on the table for our discussion from the presenters here a clear identification of a national security risk, which I actually might think there's a little bit more than we're discussing. But let me turn to the other side of the question that we are talking a bit about. The implication, even though our data set's not published yet, we have a few ideas, and we have published over the years on this topic of China's direct investment position around the world as well. In a study that Trevor Hauser and I did about 4 years ago called China Energy, a guide for the perplexed, we looked very closely at Chinese energy sector investments around the world and how they related to China's sense of its energy security needs. And one of the surprising things we found is this, that after Chinese oil firms, national oil companies, invested, say, in Sudan and used as much political capital and treasure as they could muster in the UN and every other global venue to protect the interests of PetroChina and Sinopec investing in Africa, if back home they didn't allow gas stations to raise the price of, at the pump for petrol, then those state-owned companies took that oil from Sudan and sold it to the Japanese. When their own government, when their own party, when the Communist Party was telling them, bring it home, we need it at home, there's gasoline lines around the block. and they said, screw that. If you don't raise the price of gasoline, our refineries are down for maintenance. Sorry, we're going to sell it to the Koreans and the Japanese. And that's how they behaved. So, yes, we have seen some strategic rhetoric around China's investment in a place like Africa. But in how these firms actually behave, it looks a lot more recognizable to me as typical profit-oriented international oil company behavior than some agent of the state.
I need to respond to that because I partly agree with Dan, but not entirely. There is some commercial behavior. There's also heavy intervention by the state. What investments are approved, where financing comes from, what you're allowed to pay. The classic example recently is Sinopec overpaid by nobody was even close to their bid for a Canadian oil sands firm, and that was fine because the money came from China Development Bank. It was approved by the government because it was oil sands, and it was related to China's strategic objectives. So we do have some commercial behavior by the firms, but let's not forget who's standing above the firms, who's giving them the money, who's approving them, and who's directing at a more general level the investment outward.
Let me add one more thing on this topic while we're on the question. The origin of China's restrictions on outbound direct investment that date back, all the way, were a neuroses about foreign exchange, having hard currency, right? China's coming from a moment in the 1970s where it couldn't afford to buy, so much as a drill bit to develop the Daqing field. They had to rely on loans and friendly relations with the Russians, which were not something I'd ever want to rely on after my family left in 1892. And so from that time of terrible neuroses about the availability of foreign exchange, right through very recently, there was an allergy to allowing firms to take foreign exchange abroad and invest abroad, right? Why not create jobs at home? Oddly, today, China now has the opposite problem. It is concerned with an overabundance of foreign exchange that's contributing to inflation, severe macroeconomically disruptive inflation inside the Chinese economy. And so, as regards policy toward foreign direct investment, it's no longer, for most outbound investors, required to get permission deal by deal. Only above a certain very large number for outbound flows and to sensitive countries and economies like Taiwan, or in geopolitically complicated cases like oil sands, is the Politburo going to get involved. For the vast majority of outbound deals now, notification alone is necessary from the Chinese company rather than asking for approval anymore. So the rules that describe how the government treats outbound investment in China have evolved somewhat over recent years, and we should be mindful of that.
Two more questions from the overflow room. Please comment on Chinese foreign direct investment in the tobacco and gaming sectors in the United States, and does either of your positions help to promote greater transparency and improved corporate governance in China?
Okay.
You want to think about tobacco and gaming for a while?
There's not much to think about.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Mohegan Sun in Connecticut would be out of business if it weren't for Chinese, but not as direct investors, but as gamblers. So, they're all about that. I would only say on this question of picking out specific sectors that I prefer to, revert back to principles and say only that, as concerns American policy, the only thing we need to be concerned about is our classically defined national security when it comes to parsing an inward investment, whether from China or some other economy. I don't see any China-specific threat to the gaming sector, to the strategic gaming sector in the United States. I think that industry can stand without some special scrutiny applied by the CFIUS process. In terms of governance, I do have a few things to say, but let me turn to Derek and we'll see if I have a chance to inject it.
Okay. There is potentially a lot of Chinese money that would go into gaming. I think if you're all familiar with what Macau looks like now. You know that. I don't know, I had a different reaction. I didn't know if the person was asking a question because they were threatened or because they wanted that Chinese money to come in. That's going to be the double-edged sword. So gaming will be one of those industries where there's potentially a lot of Chinese investment, and some people will oppose it, some people will be in favor of it. I agree with Dan on this issue. It's hard to imagine this being a strategic threat to the United States in any way, so it's not really important politically to those outside the industry. I'll start on corporate governance and transparency. Obviously, I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things is about the way SOEs behave, the way they're subsidized in various ways by the government. Lack of transparency is a huge issue now with Chinese firms that are listed in the United States. This is something the U.S. wants Chinese behavior to improve on. And this is something that China has a pretty big stake on saying no. So we get back to this difficult question for American negotiators and for members of Congress who I mostly deal with, which is how do you get China to change? You don't get them to change by saying it's in your interest to do what we want. That doesn't work. Right? So when you want China to change, there are different ways to do it. Some involve threats. I think corporate governance, transparency, again, I'm not promising a magic bullet, but there are ways to get China to change its behavior in a positive fashion using the bargaining that I'm talking about. They're not perfect. They may not work. But if you want China to change, the strategies the U.S. has been following to this point have left a lot of people unsatisfied.
Let me just add one thought on governance. So, I don't think using our leverage, we can get Beijing to concede to improve governance by 12% next year. You will be 12% better governed. It's just not going to happen that way. It'll take deep systemic change in China over time to create the conditions that nurture companies that have a better standard of governance. Until that time, again, to reinforce this message, nothing in our stance toward the national security advisability of saying yes to a Chinese investor precludes us from saying that a firm may only operate here if it is able to abide by the full set of U.S. law and has the governance tools available to it to comply with U.S. law. If it does not, it will not be licensed to operate in the United States. Or if it departs from its ability to do that, it can be shut down on that basis. So let's not think that we've only got one chance to say no to a poorly governed Chinese company. So I say keep the door open then, and we've got we're going to wake up to the fact that governance isn't just something you do because it's like a nice democratic thing. You do it because it's good for profits, it's good for business, it's good for shareholders. And when companies like all these deals like Sino-Forest and these blow-ups right now that raise profound questions about Chinese governance and corporate management capabilities, I want to learn that. I want to figure that out. I don't want to give anybody the excuse of saying, well, the reason we're not in America is because they won't let us in, not because we don't have the skills to do it.
Okay, back here.
Irvin Reeves Untouched. Understanding the sensitivities of security and practical and emotional dealings with China. I'm wondering, in 5 or 10 years, we're going to be talking about South America. We're going to be talking about Africa. We're going to be talking about India. Is there a way to approach this so that we are already laying the groundwork for a globalization of our policy? Because we're going to have the same issues with other developing countries.
Well, I'm actually not sure that's true. There's this idea that there's a set of emerging markets and they're all going to follow in China's footsteps. If that were true, then we shouldn't be giving the Chinese so much credit, because it's not going to be easy for India to follow in China's footsteps, not at all. And they're a long way behind. There's not going to be a lot of money pouring into the U.S. There already is some significant investment in the U.S. from Latin America. There's not going to be a huge surge. The Chinese model is a little different, as we know, and it's led to this accumulation of a lot of cash that can't be used at home. So I'm not sure that we're going to have globalization along the lines you're talking about. Related to that is there's a perception in the United States, with some justification, not necessarily entirely justified, that China is different. There are Indian state-owned enterprises, without getting into too much detail. The idea that the Indian government guides them in some way is sort of obviously false upon contact with either the government or the state-owned enterprises. So we don't have an equivalent in terms of size coming down the pike. We don't have an equivalent in terms of perhaps of the nature. So Dan's policy, what Dan has referred to very eloquently over and over again as historical U.S. policy is going to rule in most of these cases. We're not running huge trade deficits with the Brazilians. We run a relatively small trade deficit with India. All that other baggage doesn't come in. So in that sense, China is different. I don't mean it's so different that we have to treat them totally differently, discriminate against them, but I'm not sure that we have to worry about globalization of U.S. policy. U.S. policy is generally fine. The question is whether it's fine with respect to what is now the world's second largest economy, which is developed very differently than the rest of the economies in the top 10 list, and which is treated as a rival, different than Japan, politically differently in this city.
Yes, back there.
Hi, I'm Paul Ballard. I used to work at the World Bank. I'm now in private venture capital advisory work. I had a couple of questions. One was, don't we need to worry about the sort of law of unintended consequences? What I mean is, if we try to over-direct something, it may go in a different way than we expect it to in reality. And shouldn't we be looking at this from a long-term strategic standpoint? I mean, you make the point that this is a very small part of FDI into the US and a very small part of the global economy right now. Where it's going to be in 20 years' time is a lot more important. That was one point. The second point I had was there's quite a lot of analysis that suggested that Chinese SOEs are a lot less efficient than Chinese private business. In fact, I think there's a professor at Maryland who's done a study that says 92% of manufacturing GDP in China has actually come from the private sector and not from SOEs. So this suggests that actually the private sector is a lot stronger. Maybe what we want to try to do is to encourage the private sector, which has two constraints now in China, one of which is finance and the other which is labor costs, which are rising. So we're seeing Chinese companies move, for example, to Vietnam from China precisely to get around two things, trade barriers and labor costs. Should we be trying to encourage Chinese FDI into the US because it will actually do what FDI has done from other countries in the past? I'm from the UK originally. British investment built this country in the 19th century. The genius of the US, it seems to me, has been to take other people's resources and to use them to grow its own economy. Maybe it should carry on doing that. The final point I have is, do you see a difference between French SOEs investing in the States and Chinese ones? Does it make any difference that the French government is pressing Total and EDF to invest in certain ways and subsidizing them? Is that any different from Chinese SOEs? Thank you.
Good questions. Thoughtful questions. Thank you. Let me start and go backwards a little bit. So not just French SOEs, but again, this is the reason why we've taken more time than Derek to do our global database, because it would be rather easy to cast a very wide net and collect up all the sovereign wealth funds doing just mere portfolio investment around the world and say that that says something about their nation's competitiveness, their nation's readiness to operate in a complicated OECD economy. By which standard the Middle East would be the most economically competitive region of the world, rather than just a purveyor of black oil stuff that's in the ground, which is, of course, the case, not a competitive threat to American avionics or anything like that. France somewhere in the middle, of course, of the story, pretty advanced economy, and then China, further down the road, but in the long term, very much going in a direction which is globally significant. I didn't touch on our long-term estimates of what the value of Chinese outbound investment is likely to be, but in the study we put forth a bound of, say, 1 to 2 trillion of additional outbound investment by 2020. Starts to, 2 trillion here, 2 trillion there. We're starting to talk about real money, and that's just over the next 9 or 10 years time frame. And then finally, I very much do agree with one of the implications in your point, which is that this outward investment behavior by Chinese companies, whether it's Dongguan companies going to Vietnam because of labor costs, or private Chinese companies which are disadvantaged in terms of access to venture capital and growth capital in China, picking up and saying, well, to hell with it. We'll go to California and put some of our operations there. That is, in many cases, the motivation here. It's quite benign, in fact, and desirable from the American perspective. In the same way that a lot of that European investment that built America wasn't just building America, it was turning its back on Europe and saying we're going to go someplace which has a different attitude toward the role of markets and competition than we've got with all of our vested interests back home in the old world. So I think we should continue to be the new world here and not throw in our lot with some defend what we've got rather than double down our bet on competition and the role of markets going forward.
Two specific answers. Your answer about French SOEs versus Chinese SOEs, we could get into the details of their operating behavior in different environments, but politically that's not the issue. The question isn't French SOEs versus Chinese SOEs, it's France versus China. Okay? That's the political question. A commercial answer, the commercial answer about I think you've answered your own question about encouraging private Chinese investment. We would have to do something that Dan doesn't want us to do to do that, because the financing bias is overwhelmingly for state firms going out, just like it's overwhelmingly for state firms at home. It's actually even worse in terms of going out. So, I absolutely agree with you. I know a lot of private Chinese entrepreneurs who feel very, very squeezed in the last few years, and they're looking for foreign opportunities because they feel squeezed at home. But guess what? They're competing with the same state firms that are squeezing them at home, who have the same privileged access to capital, regulatory protection from competition, and on and on and on. So we'd have to act. We'd have to do something to change the pattern of Chinese commercial development, which would require some desire by the U.S. to say private Chinese companies good, state-owned Chinese companies bad. I didn't go down that road for a reason, because it's complicated, and I suggest that Dan probably wouldn't want to go down that road either.
Here's to go down that road. But I think you're going to have to go down that road if you want to execute on your point of view, which is that we're going to have to make those calls. What's a government company? What's not? Et cetera, et cetera. I think it's going to be really tough for you to do that and stick with your principles at the same time.
I don't have to go down that road. He's wrong.
Here's a broader question from somebody with Mitsui. Global dependence on China is growing, which raises the potential risk of the impact of economic fluctuations in China. Could China's foreign direct investment abroad mitigate this risk in terms of the stability and diversification of China's wealth worldwide?
I don't know that I understand the supposition that global dependence on China is growing. This gets back to global growth depends on China. If you count growth in terms of GDP, China runs a trade surplus, which means it detracts from the rest of the world's GDP. So global growth does not depend on China, and it's not going to depend on China until China stops running the world's largest trade surplus, which it has for years and years and years. There are certainly some countries that have increasingly depend on China. But those countries are tied into Chinese investment patterns. I mean, China is looking for resources and of various kinds, not just natural resources, that feed its current growth pattern. So I don't know that Chinese outward investment is going to help us diversify until we get a decision in Beijing to actually change the Chinese development model. Not to talk about changing it. They've been talking about changing it for 7 years, and consumption continues to fall as a percentage of GDP, and investment continues to rise. Right? And you have more investment than consumption, you run a balance of payment surplus. There's no way to avoid it. So global dependence on China, not really. Regional dependence on China. That outward investment is not solving that problem, it's intensifying it. It comes back to an unbalanced Chinese development model. You change that, everything else changes, including Chinese outward investment patterns.
I would put it the other way around and say that this inflection that we are just now seeing of Chinese outbound investment in more advanced economies, such as the United States, is in fact Exhibit A to say that something is fundamentally starting to change in the home domestic economy in China. As Derek correctly said earlier, the starting point for many Chinese officials is, for God's sake, don't take a dollar overseas unless you have to. If you can put it to work at home, put it to work at home. If you can create a job at home, create a job at home. And you get that from every village official to mayor to governor, right up to the top in China. That is the attitude. It's a very nativistic point of view about these things. So the fact that these companies, state-owned and otherwise, are actually taking value-added activities and putting big investments overseas to do them means that something is different about the conditions of competition, the economic opportunity back home in China. And the fact that these firms are diversifying their global position and have more of an interest in the economic growth and stability of the economies they're investing in around the world does mean to me that I think we're in a more interdependent set of circumstances than we were before. That from Beijing's perspective, the calculus has to be different. It's not just let's take care of what happens in China. We're not yet ready to worry about what's happening in the rest of the world. I think that China is more of a stakeholder in the quality of global growth as a result of this than it was in the past.
Really quickly, I agree with the stakeholder part, but I don't agree with the change in where the inflection point coming. And the inflection point is coming from returns on investment in China dropping because of overinvestment. They're coming from weakening elements of the Chinese economy from those imbalances. Now, you might say that'll signal some sort of change in Chinese policy. We haven't seen a change in policy yet. I do agree with you. So I think we're not seeing a change in the Chinese development model. I agree with you that there is increasing interdependence from Chinese outward investment.
Well, let's stay with this for just another 30 seconds if we can, Steve. I think what's fascinating about China is that I don't expect, and I've never expected, policy to lead the Chinese marketplace. I don't actually have as much faith in the government of China as Derek seems to. I don't think it's been policy leading the way toward growth and achievement in China. Mostly, it was government getting out of the way and letting people get back to work and stop wasting their lives making Mao, medallions or something like that, and instead making stuff that silly Americans were willing to buy, even though they already had 3 in the garage, right? So I think that the behavior of firms saying, man, margins are shrinking to nothing because of wages, because of new enforcement of environmental rules in Shanghai, for any number of reasons, are forcing them to behave differently. And policy will catch up, as it has to in China, and explain after the fact what Chinese firms were supposed to be doing years ago.
Okay, here's a question. Is U.S. antitrust law adequate to deal with anti-competitive practices by Chinese state-owned enterprises who invest here? Do we need new measures? And will we have to wait until the state-owned enterprises have pushed domestic competitors out of business or damaged them severely before our laws will kick in?
I'm embarrassed to say this, Dan, because we've known each other for a while. Are you a lawyer? No. Okay, so neither of us are lawyers. That's going to be a problem answering your question. I'm going to give you a very weak answer. I apologize, but we should be able to anticipate to some extent flaws in U.S. antitrust law. There are a lot of people in this room, a lot of people in the city. Well, maybe not a lot. There are people in this room, people in the city who know how Chinese SOEs behave. We have a long track record of that. We know what Chinese subsidies are. I can tell you what they are. If we can't figure out what they're doing, what they might do, that's our problem. What I would want to what I worry about is the idea that something that we can't possibly control is going to happen. This is not a mystery, right? We know what Chinese SOEs do in their behavior. We should be able to anticipate it. It's not something that should take us by surprise. So, yeah, there might be flaws in U.S. law. I'm not really qualified to address that. But I do want to fight against the idea that they're going to do something that we just can't control. I think that's wrong.
I think I have not seen it demonstrated that the competition policy challenge associated with Chinese investment somehow is unique or different or new compared to the challenges that we encountered with Japanese firms that were correctly alleged to have superior access to low-cost capital in the 80s, for instance, and we debated whether they should be blocked from buying U.S. assets because of that. Or the other point of view was, if they're willing to overpay, their taxpayers ultimately are going to fit the bill for that in some way or another, then all to the good of the U.S. seller of an asset, right? And that's the stance we took in the 80s after considerable debate. The Reagan administration ensured that we kept that line, and that line has been maintained right through the present day, including yesterday when the Council of Economic Advisors released a report on inward direct investment that essentially said we're going to stay with that Reagan-era line on this and not start drawing new lines in the sand around investment just because their cost of inputs might be different than ours.
Let me see if anybody else has a question. Pat, I'll come back to you. Yes.
Thank you. Guan Yunli from 21st Century Business Herald. Danny and Derek, you obviously represented the two very different opinions about the Chinese FDI to United States. So my question is that currently, which side is more has more influence to the White House and the Congress right now? And how about 10 years later? Because according to your predictions, the Chinese FDI will increase to one or 2 billion 10 years later. So what will this thing going to be? And second question is from the Chinese entrepreneurs angle. A lot of Chinese entrepreneurs told me that they are has huge concerns about the market access to United States. The biggest risk is that they don't know what is the risk, because right now the CFIUS use national security as a reason to ban the transactions. But you know, the national security is a very abstract word, and it's very complicated and very confused. We wish United States to have more transparent reviewing process. So what's your comment about that? Do you think U.S. should take a much more transparent processing? Thank you.
Let me start with this one. I'm sure we both want to say something about this.
Well, geographically, you could say that Heritage is closer to Congress and Peterson is closer to the White House, but there may be other factors.
That's sufficient, actually, to answer the question, I think. However, I think so. We've got position 2 versus position 3 here, you know. And I don't. Maybe there's somebody from the White House and a few people from Congress in the room here or upstairs. I'd say that if Derek's position is the more influential, then Chinese entrepreneurial firms and others have grave reasons to be concerned. That after they invest millions of dollars of initial assessment of deal opportunities, of investment possibilities, they come over, they travel, they spend money on expensive Washington lawyers, they do their homework, and then they've got a good deal, there's no national security problem with it, and it gets blocked because of some political games that need to be played to take care of Carlyle's interests in China, or Coca-Cola's, or GM's, or GE's, or Boeing's, or Motorola's, or whomever else. There's no way to predict that, because it's not about principle. It's about this golden thing, and we're going to use it, this reciprocity, right? That's open-ended. I believe that Stape's correct, actually, that the administration, White Houses since Reagan, since Ford, actually, have taken a position closer to number 2, that it's not in the U.S. interest to have that tactical ambiguity about what our attitude is about inward investment. That the U.S. is the world's biggest global investor, and our interests are maximized if we get other people to play by those rules, rather than opening up opportunity for K Street lawyers to get more fees to make sure that you run the traps and don't get caught up in Derek's dragnet.
Well, we're back to stereotyping. Of course, it is about principle, and in fact, reciprocity is even a principle, and a very good principle. Not exactly the one I'm outlining, but it's also the principle I'm outlining is to push for open markets beyond just Chinese investment in the U.S. But let me tie in the second part of your question. Who has more influence now? I have no influence over this administration at all. None, zero, zip. I could play golf with President Obama next Sunday, and I'd still have no influence. Influence over the Congress is a different thing, and it changes. I mean, when you're talking about the long term, you're talking about who's going to have influence 20 years later. It's not about, okay, I have more influence than Dan now, and Dan's going to have more influence 20 years later. It's going to go like this, and these positions are going to move. And what's one of the reasons why I want to solidify the U.S.-China relationship, because there are going to be forces buffeting it, including very negative forces. And we haven't even talked about stuff that's outside of economics, because that is a whole new can of worms that could cause problems. But I will say that I'm not sure that Dan's exactly right that the administration is at position 2. And I'll answer it by using the second part of your question. The administration is in charge of CFIUS. And you just said, why is the definition of national security so vague? I agree. The definition of national security is too vague. It's too vague in China, too. It's too vague in a lot of countries. But the administration likes the vagueness. There's no move to clarify the CFIUS role. I would like one. It's just there's an advantage to doing that. Everybody involved in the policymaking process, even if they partly agree with Dan, sees the advantage in having this tactical maneuvering, because there's a lot of U.S. discussion with China on a lot of issues, and we don't like it that our leverage is mostly negative, right? So That's a political reality. It's going to wax and wane over time. But the very fact that this administration and all previous administrations have left national security to be very vague indicates to you that they may be different from the Congress. They are. They're closer to Dan than the Congress is, but they see the advantages here as well.
Did the administration write that law, or did Congress?
Congress wrote the law, but the administration...
Did President Obama sign it, or did President Bush?
Okay. President Bush. Okay, you would go, right, okay, okay.
That's the only law we've ever had that governs this.
right.
Prior to that, it was just under executive order.
Has the administration done anything to clean up the CFIUS process, even tried to?
Well, let's talk about what needs to be cleaned up. I want to know what's not working, because actually I'm taking the position that the system we've got works really pretty well, that nobody can point me to a case that snuck through that's deleterious to American national interest that we need to fix the process to better address.
Right, and this is confusing because I flip sides. Because I've said, in response to your question,
Welcome.
I think, yes, no, I'm not, I'm over on this other side of you.
Oh, you're
No,
over there, okay.
I said that there's a legitimate complaint, and I heard it rather loudly from MOFCOM 2 weeks ago, that America defines national security too vaguely. Now, there's not a lot of staring in the mirror by the Chinese side on that point, since there are a lot of things China defines too vaguely. But as a narrow criticism of the United States, it's real, and the American response is, we're not interested in that. We like the vague definition, or at least it has some advantages, and we're not going to just change it because you don't like it, because maybe we want something from you.
Let me actually, if we can take another 30 seconds on that. I have advised folks in government now to argue back to that, that in fact our definition of national security is not so vague, that it's pretty clearly defined and pretty classic and pretty narrow in terms of what we consider a threat to the national security in the United States. We haven't opened up a big loophole to sneak in the national economic interest in some vaguely defined manner. And the virtue of just looking at the direct investment flows rather than the portfolio also is that we can say back to our friends at MOFCOM and upstairs from MOFCOM as well now, hey, how much more than 130% a year growth and Chinese investment into the United States do you need to be happy? How much more would it take for you to stop blaming our screening process for the fact that Chinese firms aren't here in droves and start recognizing the fact that they don't know how to operate outside their own borders because it's so exceptional and idiosyncratic how to operate in China that a company that's born in that environment can't really take it abroad very easily.
Yeah, we've totally flipped sides on you, and I'm sorry about that. But there's one where we stuck to the terms of the original debate, which is I think there's clear evidence right now. There are even members of the administration, with whom I have no influence whatsoever, who see advantages in vagueness in certain cases. And that is, you know, the main one that comes to mind is the equipment supply deal for Sprint, which is not technically under CFIUS mandate, went, you know, fair amount of ways, and then the Chinese companies were told to go home. And, you know, if you were really concerned, if the administration was really at Dan's position, that would have been handled differently. There would have been changes after that. There would have been some statement to the effect that we don't want to do it this way. There wasn't, because the administration sees some advantages in the way our current system is, even though it has vague elements.
Yes, here.
Gentlemen, good morning. Ben Lowson, Army staff. My question is about the fear in the U.S. of China and how this could possibly affect our relationship, primarily for Dan Rosen. Could it negatively impact it to a serious degree? And if that's the case, could Derek Scissors' plan actually allay those fears and allow us to reach the hopeful future you're looking for?
I like this guy.
Yeah. I'll buy him a beer. Because it'll take a couple beers to, I think, get through that. And we have, I think, this is round one. It's going to be 20 rounds of Chinese firms coming. You know, everybody's going to dredge up the stories of the Japanese buying Rockefeller Center again, and Yellow Dawn and all this kind of stuff. Red Dawn, Yellow Dawn. Red Dawn was the Russians. Yellow Peril, yeah. And then, you know, it'll turn out that, well, you know, they're not so alien once we've had them operating, you know, in Missouri for a couple years. We kind of get our heads around what these things are and what they're not. And I think there will be, you know, cycles. We'll go through a few cycles here of anxiety and then that settling down a little bit, which recapitulates the larger U.S. relationship over the past several hundred years as well, going from pro-bucks, good earth, where the Chinese are just like us. They're, rustic, God-loving, good people. They just have bad government around, and just need to control for bad government, to the craziness of the Mao era, to Deng Xiaoping in a cowboy hat, helping us fight the Russians, and then toggling back and forth and back and forth. I think we'll probably see the same thing play its way through with regard to direct investment here.
I completely agree with that. Part of my concern as somebody who deals with members of Congress who spend a lot of time being angry at China or acting like they're angry at China is the vulnerability to a shock. The next year's election could be that shock. Who's going to, are you going to stake out a position to make a name for yourself by bashing the Chinese? Donald Trump tried that already. Fortunately, he's so incompetent that hopefully it discredited that way of thinking. But there's a lot of stuff in play. We're reliant for good relations with China to some extent on North Korea, of all people. So there's a lot of risk here and it's not directly relevant to this discussion. I'm just saying in response to your particular question that I'm concerned, Dan's exactly right, there are going to be cycles. I'm worried about one of those dips being really, really bad.
Yeah, Pat Malloy, China Commission. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
We have several other
Yeah, I'll
questions,
quickly
so
go through this, but thank you,
very
and I appreciate you guys. We need this kind of debate about this issue. It's very important. And I do follow Congress pretty closely because we're a creature of the Congress, the Commission. Let me just, for the facts, the original CFIUS, which I worked on, was put into law in 1988, and it did not distinguish between regular and government-owned. It was amended in 1991 to make that distinction. The Dubai Ports deal got into trouble because Treasury did not treat it as a government purchase, and they didn't do the more extensive analysis. That became the political problem. Now, I read a book by Richard McGregor called The Party, in which he contends that the party has enormous influence in appointing officials to state-owned enterprises. I don't know if that's true or not, but I read that book. I found it very interesting. I did see recently that a lot of the heads of these state-owned oil companies got rotated. One of them was running a state oil company, and then suddenly he's running a provincial government. So I must be something that's different from an American corporation. Now, if you have expansion of state-owned enterprise in the United States, whether they're subs or anything else, but they're controlled by the state-owned enterprise, does that present a problem that the Communist Party then has greater access to the American political system because of our Citizens United decisions and other things along that line? These are issues I think that we need to talk about and thrash out because I think they are things that concern people on the Hill.
Okay. I mean, the party doesn't have great influence over who runs state-owned enterprises. It determines who runs state-owned enterprises. They're appointed. And they do switch positions in the government and all that. So that's right. The high heads of state-owned enterprises are party cadres. They're party figures. They're appointed by the party. Done. Now, talking about party political access to the U.S., I again have this thing where you're talking about some future development that makes it impossible to say, well, that'll never happen. But we have no evidence of it. So I don't want to make policy on the basis of something that is a long way away and we don't have evidence for. If you wanted to worry about Chinese political access in the U.S., let's look at all of ourselves in this room. China has $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves it doesn't know what to do with. All of us can be bribed. Lots and lots of bribes. And it's happening in Washington, and people are worried about it. There's nothing to do with direct investment. There's a lot of access. We're an open society. There's a lot of access to the United States political system. I don't think Chinese foreign direct investment, there may be a problem. We should prosecute it under U.S. law, but I don't think Chinese foreign direct investment is going to add to that.
Did you want to add?
I think that says well.
Okay. Let's take two questions here. Yes.
I'm Jinsong from Embassy of China. I have a question to both of you. It's about the industry structure. China's advantage is not in tertiary industry. It's about manufacturing, the second sector. But for U.S., the advantage is tertiary industry. So my question to Derek is that do you think China, you know, the China's advantage can satisfied by the exports by good. But about the FDI, the enterprise should come to the U.S. I think the opportunity mainly exists in the tertiary industry. Do you think China could threat U.S. with its disadvantage? And my question to Dan is that you said that in the future, the FDI will be increased greatly. What do you think about the opportunities will be located in which kind of industry? That's all. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And we have one question back in the rear. Let's take it at the same time.
Thank you. My name is Xiaomei Tang. I am a senior associate at WRI. My research at WRI has been focusing on assessing the climate and environmental impact of China's overseas investment. My question is for Dan, because I assume Derek doesn't believe in climate change. Coming from
She is a former intern at the Heritage Foundation, I want you to know.
That was 10
Privileged
years
information.
ago. I have a green heart. Anyway, you know that a significant portion of China's overseas investment goes to energy and resources sector. China has been building lots of thermal power plants and hydro dams in developing countries like India and Brazil. How to channel China's rapidly growing overseas investment to low carbon development is a really important topic. So I understand that the driving force will have to come from the Chinese government, and that has been the focus of our work. But I just want to know, from the international mechanism, from the international perspective, what kind of international mechanism we can leverage to channel China's overseas investment toward a low carbon development? That's my question. Thank you.
And I'm adding a final question, which I've been saving. Has former Ambassador to China John Huntsman taken a stance or expressed views on the China FDI question during his time as ambassador? You have 2 minutes between you to answer these questions.
Okay, let me just try to touch on three things here really quickly. And two questions are related to what particular opportunities for the United States arising from these growing outflows of Chinese investment. I see lots, and there's lots of good stuff to talk about. Wherever there is a comparative disadvantage for China, there's a corresponding advantage for an advanced economy such as the United States. And that entails almost anything to do with intellectual property creation. The truth is China has demonstrated precious little capacity to truly innovate. And that's occasions quite a bit of debate, but it's my considered view that Chinese firms are going to increasingly be looking to joint venturing and investing in places like the United States in order to improve their ability to innovate, even think about innovation. They'll invest in sectors which are just sort of like buying into an annuity. They're buying into U.S. power utilities, not because they're learning anything new by operating coal-fired power in the United States, but just because they understand that and how it works. So that'll add to capital formation in traditional U.S. industries, not just high-tech. So I see a pretty broad swath there. In terms of low-carbon energy space in particular, and I'm amazed to hear that WRI takes interns from Heritage.
We're everywhere.
That's amazing to me. That's great. I think probably the most effective thing for the United States to do is to embrace carbon policy for itself. If we don't fix our fundamental incentives in our own energy systems to do with their carbon footprint, then no amount of special little, let's do a little project on the sidelines of the SED is going to have a darn bit of difference in terms of these major investment flows. I think that's to start with good energy policy in the U.S. And if government's going to get more activist in the economy, I'd rather see us have an energy policy rather than have an industrial policy to sort of try to influence international investment flows per se. And then finally, in terms of Ambassador Huntsman during his tenure, so far as I recall, he said, vaguely positive things about the value of international investment flows. But really, it's only at this moment, this year, in the American debate that we're starting to have this conversation in a way that future ambassadors, such as Ambassador Locke, will be stepping up to say more about the issue, because it's only becoming a front burner issue now.
Yeah, I agree with that about Ambassador Huntsman. I mean, I recall one statement he made specifically on the topic, and it was very milquetoast, sort of lukewarm positive. And I'm not criticizing him for that. That's probably what was appropriate in his position. But the debate we're going to see, especially played out, I think, not as the main event, but on the sides of the Republican primaries, we'll learn more about what Ambassador Huntsman thinks and about what some of the other candidates think. I am going to answer that question, even though I'm from the Heritage Foundation. There's a huge incentive for China to offshore pollution now. And why not? Other countries have offshored pollution, and why not, make coal someplace else and have the pollution occur someplace else and then bring it back? Buy coal fields in Australia and burn the coal there, and a lot of other countries. I don't think, this gets back to, I'm a macroeconomist at heart. Until you change the investment in heavy industry and now infrastructure, until you change the development mode of the Chinese economy, international regulations are not going to be able to fight against that incentive. The incentives there, the economic incentives are too powerful. China has recognized that it's done very significant damage to its economy, to its environment, and now there's an opportunity to move some of that stuff offshore, just like there was an opportunity to move the steel mill out of Beijing. So unless you change the development mode of the Chinese economy, international regulations are not going to be up to low carbon investment. I'm sorry, but I am a macroeconomist, not an environmentalist, and I come from Heritage, where we hate the environment or something like that. I understand your question. I understand your question as being, can Chinese FDI hurt the U.S. advantage in services? Is that the question? Okay, good. My answer to that is the market answer, which is the U.S. has a huge advantage in services. Dan's just talked about this. Comes from a lot of different things: training, protection of intellectual property. Depends on which industry you're in. If we blow that advantage, it's not going to be because of Chinese FDI. It's going to be because we did something, akin to what the Japanese did in stagnating their economy and harming the competitiveness of a large number of firms. China should be able to, the idea of comparative advantage is, hey, we have this great services industry. Your services industry is weak. There's some trades that we can make here. But it's not going to harm Chinese investment by itself is not going to harm the U.S. advantage in services. We have to do something really systematic to do that, and hopefully we won't.
I don't think that we have exhausted this subject, but I do think that the two presenters here have enlightened us on some of the issues that we need to think about as Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States becomes more significant in the years ahead. Thank you all for coming, and let's thank our